yes, of course, I have my thoughts. You didn't really think I was going to leave you hanging, did you? It's just that, you know, that first video was already proving to be quite long as it is, and the critiques are usually a lot shorter than the synopses, so why not even them out a bit? Plus, you know, really, my thoughts probably belong here anyway. So, what did I think of Animorphs Megamorphs #1, The Andalite's Gift? What's this? Another cool iron on decal? Oh shit, I gotta try this!
A little longer than a few minutes later.
So what did I think of Animorphs Megamorphs #1, The Andalite's Gift? It was not without its problems, of course. More on that in a minute. But overall, I actually rather enjoyed it. It was never really boring, that's for sure. And the shifting POV adds a refreshing change of pace that allows for a certain degree of dramatic tension that you can't really work with when we're exclusively experiencing the world through the eyes of a single character. And the story itself, if I'm being honest, was one of the better entries up to this point. We got a compelling new threat out of the leak, and as I mentioned before, it was actually rather fun watching the Animorphs figure out exactly how they were going to deal with it. That felt weird. I need to be angry. Ideally about something stupid. Boom! As usual, the first thing that rubs me the wrong way is the cover. I mean, I get what they were going for, but goddammit did Mattingly make some weird-ass choices this time around. Perhaps at the behest of the publisher, but I don't care. Wolves, tigers, and bears, oh my, look weird with human necks. But you know what looks even weirder? A fucking fly. Flies don't even have necks. Why pick a fly? Now I know what you're thinking. They didn't have a ton of choices for Cassie. And while dolphins and humpback whales don't really have necks either, and let's face it, one of those would have been a pretty big spoiler, squirrels do. It's right here. Cassie spent at least as much time as a squirrel as Marco, who also should have been a gorilla, by the way, spent as a wolf. Hell, even a cockroach has more of a neck than a fly, but I guess they just wanted one morph on the cover that wasn't a mammal. Maybe they made Marco a wolf because we'd already seen him as a gorilla back on the cover of The Encounter. I mean, Jake's been morphing a tiger since book 1, but we've never actually seen it illustrated until now, so I get that. But then Rachel was just a bear on literally the cover of the last book. Why not go elephant? I mean, I guess the trunk could present some problems with the whole forward-facing format, but then why not go eagle? That's at least another non-mammal. I am sure that there are reasons for all of these choices, but I just wanted to go on record and say that I don't approve, like that's news to anybody watching this. And don't even get me started on that weird inside flap. Also, where the hell is Axe? I mean, I know he's new to the group and this planet, and he's still very definitely an outsider by virtue of, you know, being a completely different species, but he's definitely part of the team. Why isn't he on the cover? Or even on the inside flap? I mean, fuck, he doesn't even get a picture next to his name in the chapters that he narrates, which, by the way, outnumber local boy Tobias's chapters in this book by 2. Of course, when these books, first came out, Axe hadn't appeared on any covers or anything, so maybe they were trying not to spoil the first official reveal of what an Andalite looked like. But this right here, this is the compilation. When this came out, Axe had appeared in no less than 15 of these books and narrated 2, or at least 1. I know that the compilation didn't come out until right around the time that the second Megamorphs was going to come out, but I just don't quite know exactly how around. But still, you'd think they could have spared like $16 to get some poor intern to spend a couple of hours adding a cropped image of the cover of the alien to the headers of, 5 chapters? For that matter, why is the title The Andalite's Gift? The Andalite's Gift was and is the Animorphs' ability to morph, or I guess if we're digging for something a little bit more philosophical, the knowledge that they're not alone in the universe, or on the planet, or something. The point is, that title could apply to the entire series up to this point, except I guess maybe the first couple of chapters from the invasion. But it certainly doesn't relate in any specific way to the story that's told here, which is a shame, because as I mentioned before, it's pretty fun. Oh wait, maybe the Andalite in question was Visser 3, and the gift was Chompers? No, that makes even less sense. Speaking of how fun this new story was, I have to point out, again, because I don't know if you guys noticed, but I laid it on pretty thick during the synopsis. Do we really need an explanation of whom all the characters are and how they became Animorphs and blah and blah and blah in this fucking anthology? Now, I realize it was the 90s and the internet was barely a thing, and a lot of kids, being kids, had no money and therefore very little control over what they got to read. But for fuck's sake, did every episode of Star Trek The Next Generation open with an explanation about how Patrick Stewart is the captain and Data was an android and what Starfleet is? Did every issue of Batman open with the scene of Tom and Martha getting gunned down in an alleyway? Did every entry of the modern epic that is The Wild Thornberrys begin with an explanation of who all the members of the family are and how Eliza got the gift of gab? Yes! But those other two are solid examples. To Animorphs, Megamorphs, number 1, the Andalites gives credit. The multiple viewpoints did allow them to space it out and tailor the relevant details to the characters that are best equipped to restate them. But again, did they need to be restated? Only for people starting with this book. Oh wait, all those examples I just gave. In terms of the whole where and when is this whole shebang taking place thing, I would argue that pool party. Rachel's mentioned that it's going to be a hot day in chapter 2, the gymnastics camp thing, and just the overall lack of school in this entry suggests that maybe we've reached summer break? Or maybe it's like spring break in like a warmer part of the country. Maybe. I'll get back to you. It's dumb, but the explanation behind Marco's excommunication from High School USA's party scene is that apparently he put a Baby Ruth bar in the pool at Darlene's last party. Now, as an adult, we all recognize this as a gag immortalized in the film Caddyshack, but as a kid, it may very well have been the first time that I ever really realized just how much candy bars, especially the nutty ones, sort of resemble human waste. Maybe that's why I'm not a big fan of desserts. Since we're on the subject, I want to point out that I actually really did enjoy how much of the beginning of this book was focused on something as mundane as a pool party and social dynamics. It's very rare that we get to spend a lot of time with these kids just being kids, and then using their alien powers to be kids even harder. It was fun. I enjoy it when it happens. Okay, so I originally just wrote it as a joke when I was working on the synopsis, but the more I thought about it, seriously, why aren't the titles for the Predator and the Encounter swapped? Think about it. Sure, the Encounter is such a broad title that it could pretty much be used to describe any book in a pinch, but the book for which it is actually the title is all about Tobias' struggle to reconcile with the fact that he is now a literal The Predator. Conversely, The Encounter may be a very broad title, but the Gorilla's The Encounter with Visser 1 was one hell of an The Encounter. Seriously, I'm willing to wager that this might have actually been a legit mix-up in production, or maybe some weird meddling from like the hires up at Scholastic for some reason, because as much as I rip on old KAs, I do respect her. Oh, but back to the pool party. It was a pretty dumbass risky move for Marco to thought speak directly to Darlene. I mean, just because it's a high school party doesn't mean she's not a controller. Just saying. Oh, hey, you remember how Rachel got amnesia in this book? I mean, you should, because I assume you just watched me talk about it for like well over half of an hour. Now, I'm not a neurologist, and I'm perfectly willing to assume that these things do happen, but doesn't it seem a little bit odd that Rachel can't remember her own name? Based on that thing I just said, I want to say Daria, but she can remember esoteric ice cream flavors? Speaking of, okay, so I had seriously never heard of Ben & Jerry's Wavy Gravy before I read this book, except I guess when I first read it back in 1997, well before I could appreciate the wordplay of Misters Cohen and Greenfield. Now, according to my Dorothy Ann, Wavy Gravy is an American entertainer and peace activist best known for his role at Woodstock, as well as for his hippie persona and countercultural beliefs. Wait, a caramel and cashew Brazil nut ice cream with a chocolate hazelnut fudge swirl and roasted almonds was the Ben & Jerry's flavor, named after the American entertainer and peace activist best known for his role at Woodstock, as well as for his hippie persona and countercultural beliefs. I still don't get it, but hey, I learned something, and I hope you all did too. So this has been mentioned in books preceding, but am I really just expected to believe that the kids just record all local news now? I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a great plan in light of their situation. Like a brilliant plan. But let's be honest here. This was the 90s, which meant they had to literally physically record these to actual VHS tapes, which would mean having to constantly have blank tapes on hand. And as someone who had to set a timer on his VCR to record the Ruby Spears Mega Man cartoon on Sunday mornings because my parents required me to go to church for some reason, I can say with some degree of authority that church is way boringer than Mega Man. But even if for whatever reason Jake's dad or Marco's also dad were some kind of weirdo who just constantly had blank tapes on hand, wouldn't it look a little bit suspicious if like any of the family were controllers that these middle or high schoolers are making such an effort? A thought occurred to me when Cassie mentioned in this book for the 40th time that you can't morph shoes. Could the morphs, hypothetically, morph those like individual toed, like the weird shoes that rock climbers wear these days? I mean, it's probably a stupid question because even if those shoes existed back then, they certainly weren't readily available. But doesn't it seem a little bit weird that like they can morph bike shorts and leotards and what have you, but whenever they're forced to demorph at an inconvenient time, they're left standing around barefoot instead of wearing, I don't know, socks? Just want to point out how much I appreciate Consuela, that old crone in the cabin whose name I just made up. First, it was pretty rad to meet someone who had been controlled, but had somehow become not controlled. Second, she seemed to be mentally ill, which seems pretty reasonable for someone who had been controlled, but somehow become not controlled. Third, the way she was speaking seems oddly reminiscent of a symptom of a yerk problem that I remember features heavily in a near-future book and also our graphics department alluded to explicitly in the synopsis. Now, I know that her presence in this book is very likely a what if we did this kind of situation. But after having existed through 12 years of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I can really appreciate these little efforts at, serial foreshadowing, even if they may very well have been unintentional at the time. So Jake and Marco took the bus to that gas station. Why? I mean, obviously, it was fairly close to Axe's usual stomping ground, so it couldn't have been that far, but it was clearly far enough that they didn't want to walk it, hence they took the bus. But in that case, why not just fly? Don't get me wrong, there is a precedent. Every once in a while, someone will say something about how we shouldn't use our powers too much or something. And from a security standpoint, it was definitely the smarter choice. But one of their own is missing, and nobody seems to know why. One could make the argument that this is an emergency. Certainly more so than, say, I don't know, scaring a carny. Now, I know what you're going to say, but James, if they had morphed, then choppers would have given chase. I don't know what you sound like, but yeah, you're right, and that's kind of my point. You see, at this point, they had no idea what choppers was, let alone that it was drawn to morphing energy, so it sure seems like the main reason that they took public transportation was because KA needed them to. So, but hey, I mean, sometimes people choose to do things the long way just, for fun, and in this case, that's fine. It's not like anybody's life was in danger. In fairness, if they had flown and Kay had just decided that Choppers missed that one, I, nitpicking side that I am, would probably have just called her on that, right? Wrong! You see, because when Choppers was off-screen, I had no idea what it was up to. And as an organism, even one composed of billions of other organisms, I assume it has to spend at least some time eating, sleeping, pooping, or just otherwise doing things that might keep it from the hunt. Hell, for all I know, Visser 3 had to take it to the space vet during that time. The point is, it would have been better, but I can live with the bus thing. Around that time, Jake and Marco decide the best way to find Rachel is to morph wolves and use their smelly powers. And while that's certainly not the weakest logic in the world, I feel like it's been demonstrated many times throughout this series that apparently birds of prey can see literally everything at all times except when the writing requires them not to. Which, I guess, actually explains what I'm about to ponder, but I feel like 5 raptors would have a better chance of finding Rachel than 2 wolves and 1 raptor. But I guess a wolf's nose is better at telling you where something has been, whereas a hawk's eyes can really only tell you where it currently is. Wait, why did they do wolves again? Plus, Kaya wrote the whole knees-switching direction shit again. Oh, and then Jake is describing the smells at the scene of the crime, and he says he smells a fire, and 2 humans, and a bear, and then a smell like nothing he can imagine. Something a wolf doesn't recognize. Now, you may recall that I talked about this way back when I talked about the invasion, and how he could tell things about another dog through smell that he absolutely should not have been able to tell through smell. Well, in exactly that vein, I know that wolves have a very keen sense of smell, and they can ascertain data from a scent that we as human beings couldn't even conceive of. Whew. Come a long way, baby. But I would argue that while the smells that Jake is detecting might signal general descriptions, like large hairy predator or smaller hairless thing, to a young wolf smelling them for the first time, because again, these morphs are at least supposed to be completely fresh animals, genetically speaking. In such a case, Jake, with his 14 years of experience, it makes sense that he could fill in the gaps with his own knowledge of what a bear is, what a human is, what a fire is, etc. I'm even vaguely aware of a concept that I think is called epigenetics. Not 100% sure on that. Which posits that after generations and generations of smelling bears, these fresh animals can even know what a bear is, at least in an abstract sense, without ever actually encountering one. And by that virtue, it's entirely possible that a morph of that animal could do that as well. And of course, it's impossible for even someone with 1 million doctorates to ever say for sure exactly what an animal, or even another human being, is experiencing in the first person. So there's always a little bit of wiggle room there. I've actually forgotten where I was going with this, but I'm pretty confident that wherever it was, it actually contradicts the point I was originally trying to make. So just enjoy the fact that I introduced you to the concept of epigenetics and your subsequent research, and I'm just going to move on before you can call me on my bullshit. Speaking of that scene, how far away could Tobias and the guys have been when Rachel was trapped in that schizophrenic former controllers on fire basement cage thing? Axe was on his way to meet him and the boys, and there was presumably a huge pillar of smoke in the sky. How far could Rachel have possibly wandered from that initial crow attack? Far enough away that two wolves, actively being pursued by a swarm of alien destruction, couldn't reach her in time? Sure. But I refuse to believe that Tobias didn't think a forest fire was worth looking into, because he most definitely saw it. What is he, on the Brazilian government's payroll? Muddying the waters of the whole when and where bit that I did earlier, but I'm only mentioning it now because I tend to approach these thoughts in chapter order. Cassie explicitly says that before she went to the mall in search of Rachel, she went to the school. And that's fine, but as I've already mentioned, the whole vibe of this book seems to suggest that school's out for summer. Granted, it's entirely possible that Rachel went to the school during summer break. Hell, it's even probable because that absolutely happened because there was a whole chapter about how exactly that happened. But doesn't it seem a little bit weird that Cassie would check there first before going to Rachel's supposed favorite place in the whole world? Oh, wait, they explained that. Cassie checked there because that's where she should have caught the bus, which might make sense if they hadn't already spotted her dodging ice cream on the freeway. And then, of course, Cassie just walks right into an employees-only area in a shop in a mall. And while I am willing at this point to accept that maybe security cameras are just scarce in this particular mall, or even the 90s in general, I was a kid. I don't know. It still pisses me off that Cassie just assumes that there aren't any. Seriously, just give me a sentence. I did a quick search for black bubbles in the ceiling. That's all I need. Come the fuck on. I do just want to take a second to note that I really appreciate how this book makes it clear that at least some of the controllers have maybe considered the idea that these Andalite bandits might not be that. So as far as my boy Chompers goes, I do have questions. And while the lack of answers by no means constitutes any sort of plot hole, I still have to ask them. First of all, I have no problem with the Valik having been found on our very own Saturn. It is a huge swirling ball of mostly hydrogen about which we know precious little. So this life form existing on it, a life form that is, for most intents and purposes, ostensibly a gas, and we don't know about it, that is totally fine with me. But how? No, I mean, not how that, just how? How did they find it? How did they catch it? How does it feed on energy? How is that energy different from the energy that all of us Earthlings consume in the form of calories? How is morph energy any different from any other kind of energy? How did Visser 3 train it to detect morph energy? I mean, obviously he used himself as bait, because what the hell else would he use? But how did he do that without ending up all Steve Buscemi at the end of Fargo? For that matter, how do people train the dogs not to tear the fox apart? Again, I'm not saying that any of these are plot holes, or even that they don't have answers, though I still refuse to believe that morphing gives off a distinctive energy. Wouldn't it just be heat? I just wanted you guys to know that I'd thought of them. If Miss Applegate, or one of her editors, or fact checkers that Scholastic absolutely did not employ while these books were being written, want to answer one or any of them, feel free to slide right into my DMs. Also, seems kinda weird that the Yeerks have a word for pet, as they're functionally blind goldfish in their natural state. Then again, it seems kinda weird that they have a language at all, so I'll let it slide for the time being. So I know I've mentioned in the past how it sure would be smart for our heroes to acquire a Hork-Bajir morph. You know, just in case they ever had to sneak into some controller facility but didn't feel like doing it as an easily squashed bug. But fans, and let's face it, the characters themselves, have cited certain ethical quandaries when it comes to acquiring a sentient creature without their consent. And while I very loudly disagree, I can at least understand the other side of the argument. However, you know what also might be a really useful morph for a group of kids who are constantly trying to keep their enemies convinced that they are in fact Andalites? A Tyrannosaurus Rex. Can't really fault them for not thinking of that, but almost as useful would be an Andalite, and all you bleeding hearts could stow it, because they actually have a specimen who is not only capable of giving consent, but is also one of their closest and only friends. Now, sure, the Andalites are a very proud, even narcissistic people, so Axe very well might say no, in which case we'd be back to square one. And while I would very loudly disagree with Axe for saying no, citing my usual ends justify the means, or how a slippery slope is only a problem if you don't stop, as demonstrated by esteemed logician Laura Numeroff's seminal work on critical thinking, and how, again, being able to look exactly like a creature is absolutely not the same thing as enslaving it, what bothers me the most is that nobody seems to have even thought of this idea. On page 109, Cassie specifically states that in addition to being able to fly in whatever the hell direction they want, flies can hover. Now, I'm not an entomologist, and even if I was, we have no idea what specific species of housefly these lovable rascals acquired back in the capture. The rarely seen neck fly. But I was more than prepared to dig into this little tidbit because I, in my 30 years on this planet, have never seen what I would describe as a housefly hover at all. They're always zipping around in some direction, am I right? Of course, just cursory research on Google revealed that there definitely are at least some species of flies that can hover, called hoverflies. Real clever. Who named these things, Visser 3? And I couldn't find anything that conclusively said that most can't. So really, I guess this is more of a question than a criticism. Can your average house fly hover? And if not, which ones can, and what are the odds that the Animorphs would have acquired one? Anyone? Related, but definitely harder to measure, and most assuredly less researched as a result, Cassie's hearing as a fly sure seems pretty damn clear. Like 5G clear. I wonder, was there ever a time in which the Animorphs had to morph something small, but they also really wanted to be able to hear what was going on around them? Perhaps an instance in which maybe having a fly's superior mobility would have been valuable? But seriously, why are they morphing roaches in the first place? I mean, I know they needed something small, but why not morph flies? They're smaller, faster, incredible reflexes. They all already have that morph. I mean, I guess the idea was that cockroaches can hear better, but not only do I not buy that, I mean, especially if the flies were to, I don't know, land on something. But I feel like the vastly superior speed and maneuverability would have far outweighed the slim chance that they might be in the right place to maybe hear a random controller possibly mention something he or she has absolutely no reason to mention a little better. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this might be the first book to confirm that injuries sustained in one's native form are healed when they morph and morph back. Obviously, we know that morphing out of a morph heals wounds, thanks to Marco's little run-in with Jaws 4 back in the message. And I don't want to give anybody the wrong idea and make them think that I have a problem with this. It makes perfect sense. It's just I'm not sure we've ever heard it specifically addressed until an amnesiac Rachel's feet were healed when she decided to stop being a bear. Wait, so amnesia can be caused by a great many things, many of them purely psychological or drug-induced. But seeing as how Rachel seemed to be firing on all cylinders right up until her tiny bird skull met that tree, it's gotta be head trauma, right? Like, damage to her brain? So... During that exciting car chase, Marco makes reference to a video game entitled Wipeout. It is a very real franchise, albeit one that I had not heard of before reading this, and its first entry came out back in 1995, which also makes it a clue as to the timeline. During that very same chase, a fellow driver made a gesture with his fingers. It is a very real gesture, and in fact it is probably the very closest we will ever get to a good old-fashioned cuss in this silly series. Speaking of driving, the setting, and cussing, fuck. Another driver posits that Marco learned to drive in Jersey. Now this suggests, at least to me, that the story probably doesn't take place in New Jersey. But speaking as someone who lives close enough to that state that I see their drivers often, it may even be evidence that the story takes place close enough to that state that that driver sees their drivers often, and also that the story takes place sometime after New Jersey was admitted to the Union for some reason in 1787. Not conclusive, by any means, but certainly worth noting. Okay, so, in a weird twist, it actually doesn't bother me that much that the Valik turns slowly. Sure, it's composed of millions of tiny, fast-moving, independent organisms, so one would think that all it really has to do to turn around is for each of them to just turn on a dime. But at the same time, we really have no way of knowing exactly how these creatures interact with one another. I mean, they're capable of bonding together into, like, teeth and eyes. So, really, as I'm just now realizing is becoming kind of a running theme in this particular critique, I'd just like to hear an explanation. Around that time, you remember how there were two bug fighters hovering over Rachel and Cassie and an incapacitated gorilla? Sure seems pretty weird that nobody on those bug fighters seems to be able to identify those humans as humans. Of course, it's never been clear that it is in this book that most of the Yeerks don't really seem to care all that much about world domination. They just care more about not getting decapitated by their leaders that care that much about world domination. So, I'm declaring right now, I'm done pointing these things out, unless they're part of another lateral point that I'm trying to make, so you're welcome in advance for the 2 episodes that probably lasts. Been thinking about this. How did they shake the Valik that first time around? I mean, every morph is eventually followed by a demorph, Tobias notwithstanding. So, let's take a second. The first time that we see the Valik, it's chasing Marco and Axe while they're demorphing from mice, right? At the party. Then it zips off in the direction of Rachel, who's currently demorphing from an eagle. And then it chases her for a little while, even though it seemed like she was finished demorphing by the time it got there. And then demolishes that ice cream truck, and then just gives up. I mean, it's not unreasonable. She was done morphing, so maybe it didn't know what to pursue, but it has all those eyes. The car chase scene makes plenty of sense. Constant morphing and demorphing meant that the Valik was always chasing something new, and while it's pretty clear in hindsight that it probably would have been better if they'd just given up their keep-away plan once the Valik failed to pick up an elephant, they didn't really have any way of knowing that at the time. But then, at the end of the book, everybody morphs dolphins. The Valik zooms right up to them and then just sort of follows the dolphins, which I assume it can't even see under the surface of the water, as they swim toward the Great One. I mean, I know Cassie said that they were doing partial morphs to keep it interested, but then it has eyes, at least when it wants to, but it's also really dumb. But then again, like I said, I'm pretty sure that Rachel was fully human well before she actually got to the freeway, so what dragged it onto the freeway to destroy that ice cream truck in the first place? What's that? Oh, it's narrative convenience? Yeah, it's narrative convenience. I know that these videos usually skew negative because, well, I hate everything, to the point that Katie actually uses my respect for Hamilton to exemplify its value to the uninitiated. But I gotta point out that I love some of the turns of phrases that Marco utilizes to describe the process of becoming a gorilla. Shoulders like a cement truck, even though cement trucks don't have shoulders. Neck like a fire hydrant, even though fire hydrants don't have necks. I love a good simile. Have you noticed that the strength of Dracon Beam seems to vary pretty wildly? I mean, back in The Predator, Tobias describes a single shot as vaporizing a deer. Now, obviously, an elephant is much bigger and sturdier than a deer, but those Dracon Beams didn't obliterate a deer-sized chunk of Rachel either. Plus, these are the onboard Dracon Beams of a spaceship rather than, like, a handheld one. You'd think they'd be stronger. Then again, that pickup truck did break Rachel's leg, and I've never heard of an automobile disintegrating a deer. Of course, I'm no stranger to the genre, so it's reasonable to assume that they probably have, like, power settings, but still, I just wanted to point it out. When Axe was in his cell, and the flea bit him, and he realized that that's exactly how he was going to escape, he goes out of his way to reach for the flea, and then proceeds to do it 2 more times before he finally catches it so he can acquire it. Now, I'm not saying that that was the only flea in the room, but it definitely wasn't. But it begs the question, is there another stupid unwritten rule that says that they have to acquire things with their hands? I mean, as soon as he remembered that he was lousy with them, or flea with them, or whatever, couldn't he have just concentrated on a flea and just acquired any random one that happened to be lurking on his person? Related, but decidedly less stupid, question. A couple of chapters later, when Axe launches his crafty little plan to sick chompers on the good Visser, he unmorphs just a teeny little bit, and then resumes flea mode. Now, this isn't all that strange. I was going to say that we've seen it before, but off the top of my head, I can't think of any specific instances from the first 7 books. But obviously there are several instances of partial demorphs in this book, and I'm sure it happens at numerous times in the rest of the series. What was my point? Oh, right. How does partially demorphing affect the morph clock? If at all. I mean, like, if you demorph halfway at some point during a regular morph period, can you, like, extend your time by a few minutes? I mean, I feel like it would be really good information to have. And if I'm being honest, now that I think about it, it would not surprise me if it came into play in a major way as a plot point in some later books. So, yeah, just consider this me going on record now. So do you guys remember when the Andalite and Marco jumped out of the blade ship and they were all like, "Oh, shit, we're gonna die!" Well, Marco explicitly claims that they're about 2 miles up, which normally I would just take as Marco adding not necessarily accurate details to sell the bit. But then he says it again at the beginning of the next chapter. I might not even normally bring it up, but this has happened before. You may recall, again, back when I was talking about The Predator, Tobias made that claim that his friends were falling from 700 feet up. You may also recall that I calculated that left them about 7 seconds before they hit the ground, and that the most logical explanation for how they were able to fully morph into birds in that time was simply that Tobias has a terrible sense of distance. Now granted, 2 miles puts that time quite a bit higher, around 45 seconds to a minute, and that's even long enough that I'm willing to accept the whole, if the adrenaline's pumping hard enough, you can morph faster explanation. But why do these people feel that they can estimate these huge distances with any accuracy? And more importantly, why does the author feel so comfortable picking these random but incredibly specific numbers, knowing full well that there are nerds out there that will fact-check her shit? Just say a few miles up, or hundreds of feet, or something. I mean, fuck. I appreciate that Jake got fucking grounded, even if he was written out of in less than a chapter. It's nice to be reminded every once in a while that the main characters do have parents who, at least in theory, care about their children, Tobias notwithstanding. Oh. Now I'm sad. I know I talked a little bit about Rachel's amnesia before, but, come on. Can we all just sort of agree how ridiculous this whole thing is. Not the amnesia itself, necessarily. I mean, that was at least... It was an interesting way to kind of mix up the story a bit. I'm talking more how, like, as soon as she's reunited with her friends, she's pretty much back to being 100% Rachel in, like, a second. And perhaps more importantly, how I can pretty much guarantee that this whole incident will never be mentioned again. I mean, I'm not psychic, but I guess time will tell. I'm sorry that it keeps coming back to the Predator and all of the manifold problems that I had with that book. But I have to point out that in this book, Tobias explicitly states that his eyes are not adapted to see through water like a bald eagle or an osprey, which means that he knows that a bald eagle and an osprey are fishing birds, which means he probably knew a couple of months ago when his team was out there fishing with fishing rods that they probably fashioned out of sticks or something, that bald eagles and osprey are fishing birds, since I don't see him spending a lot of time down the local library in that time. Oh, I should probably mention that I really do hope that I didn't make it sound like I disliked the way that the final gambit was written. You know, the way that it was sort of explained to us step by step as it was unfolding, or not even really explained, shown, rather than told, though that doesn't really work as well when you're talking about the written word. I mean, I already said this bit in the synopsis, but I just wanted to be clear. I did like the execution. But I have to wonder, have the kids ever heard of a fire hose? Now, I know what you're thinking. Not just anybody has access to a hose so potent that it can lift a grown man off the ground or shatter a window. But indulge me for a second. Just picture the Animorphs and Axe, who I'm mentioning separately here only because the Animorphs themselves seem to insist on it, setting up somewhere with a handful of garden hoses. Let's say 5 garden hoses. And then Rachel morphs into an elephant, already proven too heavy for chompers to lift. Well, now wait a minute. Where could they possibly set up so many garden hoses while also maintaining the privacy and anonymity that they require? I mean, I could be remembering wrong, but I'm pretty sure that one of the, main members of the team lives on, a farm. Way out in the boonies. So, that would probably have, ample hose hookups, right? Ah, but maybe regular garden hoses just plain aren't powerful enough to take out the Valik. I mean, that may be true. Maybe chompers really just required complete and total submersion. Though let's be fair, they had no way of knowing that. Okay, so Rachel goes to the beach, wades out into the surf, goes Dumbo, and then just keeps wading. I mean, elephants are very strong swimmers. Plus, they come with their own built-in fire hose to take out the stragglers, so 2 fire hoses if it's a boy. Look, I'm really just spitballing here. Obviously, none of these solutions are nearly as exciting as what we actually got. And let's be honest, with such a franchise-ending foe as the Valik, our heroes were completely justified in going as extreme as possible so as to leave the most minimal chance that this fucker would survive. Plus, to give Cassie a chance to do something, reminding us all that she's not completely useless. But I have to say, it sure is lucky. Not unbelievable, especially with it being, daytime and all. Just lucky that the Visser did not decide to dispatch bug fighters this time around. I mean, what with the, probably 15 minutes between Cassie first morphed a dolphin and then finally morphed a whale at cruising altitude, they absolutely could have gotten there in that time, and then just blasted Cassie into lamp oil. I mean, how busy could they possibly be? Plus, I am a little annoyed at the realization that a whale, as the largest group of extant animals on the planet, might just be a really useful morph for everyone on the team to have in their back pocket just in case, if only because there is no other terrestrial animal that can match them in that regard. Unfortunately, I can't think of any instance in which they've had the opportunity to acquire one. Oh, wait! Yeah, ethics and all that, but you may recall that nobody even bothered to ask back in the message. At the very least, it would have saved Tobias the effort of finding one this time around. Granted, that would have dropped his chapter count down to 2, but hey, nobody forced him to miss that fucking forest fire. I will point out that at least some of the fandom seems to believe that the Great One in this book is the same Great One that appeared back in the message. I couldn't personally find anything that explicitly stated that, and let's face it, I mean, humpbacks are hard in my great race, so here's me taking the author's side for once. Speaking of Operation Shamu Drop, I would bring up the falling distance thing again, but the Valik provides ample unknowable variables, so I don't really feel the need to. I guess I could have just left this out. Is that it? Huh. I guess so. Well, I appreciate you guys sticking around for... My God, how long is this thing at this point? And I do hope you enjoyed my rantings on this particularly chock-a-block entry in the Animorphs series. Do any fans out there have a lesser aversion to Seropedia that might be able to double-check and see if my encounter versus predator theory holds any water? Or maybe you're an expert on housefly morphology, and you can confirm that they can or can't hover. Or, I guess, have necks. I mean, how do they train hunting dogs not to just eat their quarry? I really don't know. If you have an answer to any of these questions, please comment accordingly. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and check out our Patreon page if you'd like to help us / me make more videos / like this one. This is normally where I would tell you to keep an eye out for my book talk on the next book in the series, but before I get around to the alien, I think I'm going to do like a series recap. You know, after each Megamorph seems like a logical time to do it, and I'll look back at the series up to this point and dissect it, review some vital statistics, maybe include some original artwork. You know, should be fun. And perhaps more importantly, it should not take nearly as long to produce as this one did. So with that, I have, as always, been James R. Katie of Under 655 Studios.
655.
Peace out, nerd. All right, well, that's a wrap on Megamorphs, guys.
Can we go home now?
Oh, yeah, I mean, I really only need you guys for that last bit. Hey.